In this video, we'll learn how to set Octane as our render engine and just familiarize ourselves with Octane's overall user interface and find out where all the related Octane for Cinema 4D options are within Cinema 4D. In order to set Octane as your render engine, you need to go to your render settings, and here using the render dropdown, you can choose Octane to be your render engine. And that's it. Now we can come down to the Octane renderer section down here and take a look at some of the Octane settings. Unlike other render engines, this is not the place where you control most of the Octane render settings actually. We'll get back to this window later on in this lesson. Instead, we have a dedicated Octane settings window that can be accessed from the Octane menu. So let's go to the Octane menu and open up Octane settings window. Probably the first thing you want to configure when using Octane as a GPU render engine is to define the GPU or GPUs that you want Octane to use for rendering purposes. In order to do that, come over to the Settings tab and then the Devices tab. Here we can pick and choose which GPUs we want Octane to use. In this PC, I have an RTX 3070 and an RTX 2060 Super, and both of them are enabled, and therefore Octane uses both of them when we start rendering. If you want a specific GPU to not be used, simply disable it here. Now let's get back to the kernels tab. Kernels are the most important part of the render settings, and here you control how Octane handles light interactions within the scene. We have a few different kernel types. By default, it is set to direct lighting. We also have info channels, path tracing, photon tracing, and PMC. Once you select a kernel, then you can control that kernel using the settings down here. Most of the time you would use path tracing as it is both realistic and efficient. We'll talk about these kernels throughout the course and more specifically in the rendering section. Then we have the camera imager section where you control the output behavior of the camera globally, stuff like exposure, white balance, denoising, and so on. Most of these settings can be controlled per camera when using Octane Camera. Then we have the post tab to control post effects like bloom, glare, and volume effects. Again, these can be controlled per camera as well. And finally, we have the settings tab where you can choose and pick your GPU devices, sign out of your account, color management, and bunch of other settings. If I get back to the Cinema 4D's render settings window and come down to the Octane renderer section, under the main tab, you would control some of the render output settings like color space, network rendering, deep image output, Orbex exporter, and so on. Basically, how Octane outputs the image is controlled here. Under the override kernel settings, you can override the kernel settings in the Octane settings window and adjust them here. But remember, the settings that you put in here only will be used for the final render. If you don't activate it here, the kernel settings in the Octane settings window will be used for interactive rendering and also for the final render. And finally, you can use the AOV tabs to control or manage your arbitrary output variables or render passes. We'll get back to this later on in the course. Now let's get back to the Octane menu and open up the live viewer window. Live Viewer is the central hub of your Octane rendering experience. A lot of things in Octane go through the Live Viewer. You can start and pause an interactive render, create cameras, lights, objects, materials, access Octane settings window, and much more. We also have this Octane dialog window that can be accessed through the Octane menu. And this window is very similar to Octane Live Viewer window, but it only has the menu and the toolbar and not the render view. This can be useful sometimes, for example, when you want to render in the Cinema 4D's viewport, but still have access to the same tools and commands of the Live Viewer. You can create Octane materials from the material manager. For example, let's create a standard surface material. Now we can open up the material and work on it in the traditional material editor or access the node editor for this material and develop the shader using the Octane node editor. If we get back to the material manager, we have this Octane menu where you can create different Octane materials, open up the node editor or the texture manager, or convert Cinema 4D materials to Octane materials, or open up the live database to access community materials. The live viewer has a materials menu, which is the same as the Octane menu in the material manager, with a bit more commands and functions. But I'll be creating most of my materials from the create menu of the material manager, and I won't use this Octane menu in the material manager. And if I need it, I'll just use the materials menu in the live viewer. And finally, we can right click on any object in the object manager and add an Octane tag to it, like a light tag, a camera tag, or an object tag, and so on. So this was a quick introduction on how to set Octane as your render engine and its user interface in Cinema 4D. We will explore everything in detail throughout the course, but this is enough for now. See you in the next one.